The container ships slow first, then stop. At the approaches to Keelung and Kaohsiung, Taiwan's two largest commercial ports, the traffic that normally moves without pause begins to back up. A line of vessels, then two lines, then a queue stretching beyond the horizon. The People's Republic of China has announced a series of maritime security exercises in 6 designated zones surrounding Taiwan. The zones cover the approaches to every significant port on the island's western coast. No shot has been fired. No invasion fleet is on the horizon. The declaration contains no explicit threat. And yet the global shipping industry, which cannot afford to send a vessel into a zone where the PLA Navy is conducting live fire exercises, has effectively halted. In Taipei, the presidential office is on emergency footing. In Washington, the National Security Council has convened. In Tokyo, the Japanese Defense Ministry is tracking the planned fleet dispositions that have been building for the past week. This is not a war. Not yet. It may never become one. But it is something the international community has no established protocol for responding to. A coercive action that sits precisely below the threshold that would trigger the alliance commitments and the military responses that open war would demand. This is how a blockade scenario works. And this is the command structure. The scenario we are analyzing is not a hypothetical with no historical basis. It is the logical extension of a coercive pressure campaign that has been building for decades. The Chinese Civil War ended without a formal peace treaty or any internationally recognized settlement of Taiwan's status. The Taiwan Relations Act of 1979 committed the United States to providing Taiwan with defensive arms and to maintaining the capacity to resist any non-peaceful resolution of the Taiwan question. A deliberately ambiguous formulation that neither guarantees military intervention nor excludes it. The 1995 to 1996 Taiwan Strait Crisis is the most significant recent precedent. China conducted missile tests into the waters near Taiwan's major ports. The Clinton administration deployed 2 carrier battle groups. China backed down. But the episode drove a massive Chinese military modernization investment aimed at ensuring that the same U.S. response would carry much higher costs in any future crisis. A full amphibious invasion of Taiwan would be the most operationally complex and logistically demanding military operation attempted since the Second World War. A blockade offers a different strategic logic. It applies economic and military pressure on Taiwan without committing PLA ground forces to the catastrophic risk of a contested amphibious landing. It creates a crisis that Taiwan must respond to, diplomatically, economically, and potentially militarily, without providing the unambiguous act of aggression that would automatically trigger international responses. Taiwan imports approximately 97% of its energy requirements. A blockade that effectively halts this flow would impose economic costs that accelerate over time and could, in theory, produce political pressure for negotiation without a single shot being fired. Then Taiwan sits at the center of the first island chain, the arc of islands that constrains Chinese naval power projection into the open Pacific. TSMC produces approximately 90% of the world's most advanced semiconductor chips. A blockade that disrupted Taiwan's ability to operate its fabrication facilities would cascade through defense electronics, consumer technology, automotive, and medical systems worldwide. The Taiwan Strait carries approximately 48% of global container shipping by volume. The demonstration effect may be the most consequential dimension of all. If a Chinese coercive blockade of Taiwan succeeded, if it produced political concessions from Taipei without triggering effective international response, the precedent would fundamentally alter the strategic calculations of every government in the Indo-Pacific. All analysis of Chinese military action in a blockade scenario must begin with the political authority structure. The Central Military Commission, CMC, is chaired by the General Secretary of the CCP. Since 2012, that position has been held by Xi Jinping, who has consolidated personal control over the military to a degree not seen since Mao Zedong. This centralization has operational implications. In a crisis, the CMC can authorize the use of military force with a speed and decisiveness that is structurally impossible in the U.S. system. The limitation is equally significant. A system in which all major decisions flow through a single point of authority is a system in which the accuracy of information reaching that authority is decisive. There are no institutional checks to correct errors in the CMC's assessment. The Eastern Theater Command, headquartered in Nanjing, would be the primary operational authority for a Taiwan blockade. It controls assigned naval, air, ground, and rocket forces in an integrated joint command structure. The Eastern Theater Command would be responsible for the operational design of the blockade, the positioning of naval patrol lines, the declaration and enforcement of maritime and air exclusion zones, and the coordination of PLAN, PLAF, PLARF, and gray zone forces. The plan's surface combatant force would establish patrol lines at defined distances from Taiwan's coast, enforce the declared exclusion zones, and conduct the inspection of commercial vessels. The planned submarine force is the blockade's most operationally significant element. On approximately 60 submarines operating in surrounding waters would threaten any surface vessel attempting to run the blockade. The PLAAF would enforce the air exclusion zone. J-20 stealth fighters and J-16 multi-role aircraft would conduct continuous air patrols over the declared exclusion zones. Taiwan's airports would effectively cease to function as international hubs. The PLA rocket force's role is primarily deterrent rather than kinetic. The DF-21D anti-ship ballistic missile and the DF-26 create an operational risk environment for any naval force attempting to break the blockade, including U.S. carrier strike groups. The China Coast Guard, technically a law enforcement agency, has been built to a scale and capability that exceeds most navies. In 2021, Chinese law was amended to explicitly authorize the Coast Guard to use weapons against foreign vessels in waters claimed by China. The legal ambiguity of Coast Guard action: is it law enforcement? Is it military force? Is operationally deliberate. It complicates the response calculus for vessels and states uncertain whether a given action constitutes an act of war. The maritime militia provides a deniable presence at sea. Fishing vessels crewed by militarized personnel to saturate near coastal waters with legal and tactical complexity. Taiwan's armed forces in a blockade scenario face a fundamentally different problem from a straight military defense. A blockade is not an invasion. It does not present a target that conventional capabilities are designed to defeat. Taiwan's critical energy vulnerability: approximately 97% of energy is imported. Its strategic reserves provide a buffer measured in weeks to months. A blockade's ultimate objective is political: to produce concessions. And the duration over which a democratic population can sustain economic pressure without producing political pressure for accommodation is the central variable the blockade's designers cannot know in advance. The response of the United States and its regional allies would be the most consequential variable in the scenario, and the most uncertain. The Taiwan Relations Act creates a commitment to provide Taiwan with arms and to maintain the capacity to resist non-peaceful resolution. But the TRA does not define the threshold at which the U.S. would respond with military force. Japan is the most directly affected U.S. ally. Japan's energy imports transit the sea lanes adjacent to the Taiwan Strait. Any disruption to Taiwan Strait shipping affects Japan's economic security directly. A naval blockade operates through two primary mechanisms: physical interdiction and psychological deterrence. Commercial shipping insurance is underwritten by a relatively small number of major markets. The declaration of a maritime exclusion zone by a major military power is sufficient to produce an immediate and substantial increase in war risk premiums. At a certain premium level, commercial operators will simply reroute rather than pay. This means a blockade can be effective without physically stopping any vessel. The insurance market does the interdiction, and the eastern approaches through the Philippine Sea are the most operationally challenging for China. The decision about whether to include the eastern approaches is a direct measure of China's assessment of U.S. military resolve. The PLARF's anti-ship missile capability is the single most consequential military factor in the international response to a Taiwan blockade. The operational significance of the DF-21D is not that the missiles would necessarily be used. It is that their existence changes the risk calculus of the U.S. decision to send carriers into the threat zone. A carrier that cannot contest the airspace over Taiwan cannot be an effective instrument for breaking the blockade. The electronic warfare dimension would be employed from the early hours. Jamming of Taiwan's military radar systems, GPS signal degradation in the exclusion zones, and interference with civilian maritime and aviation communications. Cyber operations would compound the economic pressure of maritime and air exclusion with a direct attack on Taiwan's power grid, financial system, and telecommunications. A blockade scenario would not begin with an announcement. It would begin with a process, potentially months in duration, of escalating gray zone pressure. A DIZ incursions increasing in frequency and depth. Coast Guard assertive patrols around Taiwan's offshore islands. Maritime militia establishing persistent presence near port approaches. Cyber probing operations testing response times. Each activity is deniable as military coercion, because each can be characterized as legitimate security operations or routine exercises. The formal blockade declaration, framed as a maritime security exercise with exclusion zones, would be the transition from gray zone to overt coercive action. The initial exclusion zones would cover the western approaches to Taiwan's ports, while leaving the eastern approaches technically open. This serves two purposes. It preserves a face-saving exit ramp for China, while applying maximum immediate economic pressure on Taiwan. If the international commercial response is to halt routing through the strait, as the insurance market's war risk calculations would suggest, the blockade achieves its economic effect without a single act of military interdiction that could be characterized as an act of war. If the initial declaration produces the commercial routing halt without a significant military response, China would likely sustain and progressively deepen the blockade. The 72-hour exercise would be extended to 7 days, then to 30 days, with each extension framed as a response to Taiwanese military activity. PLAAF aircraft would begin intercepting commercial flights approaching Taiwan. Taiwan's airports would effectively cease to function as international hubs. The PLARF's readiness posture would be adjusted to maximum alert, visible to U.S. and Allied satellite surveillance, designed to be seen. The cost of military intervention is being demonstrated without being incurred. Taiwan's response would operate simultaneously across military, economic, and diplomatic tracks. Navy corvettes and fast attack craft would patrol inside territorial waters. Air Force sorties would contest the air exclusion zone at the Strait median line. The Xiongfeng anti-ship missile batteries would be deployed and made visible. Emergency rationing and energy reserve drawdown procedures would begin. Taiwan's crude oil reserve buffer, approximately 30 days under normal conditions. A blockade's ultimate objective is political. Whether it achieves that objective depends entirely on how Taiwan's democratic government and population respond to the economic pressure. Historical cases of blockade suggest that early solidarity gives way to economic stress within weeks to months. The U.S. response would be the most consequential variable in the scenario, and the one about which the most honest analytical answer is, we do not know. What can be analyzed are the options and their trade-offs. Diplomatic engagement without military movement preserves optionality, avoids escalation risk, but provides no immediate material support to Taiwan and demonstrates that the U.S. is deterred by the PLARF's architecture. Freedom of navigation operations. Strong legal basis in international law, but depends on what happens when a U.S. vessel transits a zone enforced by planned patrol ships. Carrier strike group deployment. The most direct demonstration of U.S. resolve. Also the option most directly challenged by the PLARF's anti-ship missile capability. The terminal phase of a blockade scenario is the most analytically uncertain. The escalation pathway. An incident at the exclusion zone boundary transforms coercive blockade into open military conflict. Its probability increases over time as Taiwan's economic pressure grows. The breakthrough pathway. A coalition of states organizes a convoy operation to resupply Taiwan through the Philippine Sea. Escorted by naval forces sufficient to deter planned interdiction. The closest historical analog to the Berlin airlift or the Atlantic convoy operations. The negotiated pause pathway. Diplomatic engagement produces a suspension of the blockade in exchange for political commitments by Taiwan that fall short of formal sovereignty concessions. Historically, the most common resolution of coercive pressure campaigns. Neither full capitulation nor full confrontation, but a negotiated ambiguity that allows both sides to claim partial success. Whatever the specific resolution, the event itself would produce information about the functioning of the deterrence architecture that currently governs cross-strait relations. And if the blockade succeeded, the deterrence architecture would have demonstrably failed. Every government in the Indo-Pacific would receive the same signal. Chinese coercive action below the threshold of outright invasion is not effectively deterred. If the blockade was broken, China's coercive toolkit would have been demonstrated to have limits. The U.S.-led alliance system would have demonstrated credibility under pressure. The most likely outcome, a negotiated pause, would leave the deterrence architecture in a state of deliberate ambiguity. Each side would draw different conclusions from the same event. Even a brief blockade of 2 to 4 weeks before diplomatic resolution would produce severe and globally extended economic consequences. A 2-week halt to Taiwan Strait traffic would require rerouting of approximately 48% of global container shipping around South Asia and the Cape of Good Hope, adding an average of 7 to 14 days to transit times. The semiconductor cascade would be slower, but potentially more damaging. TSMC's fabrication facilities have inventory buffers for most inputs, but the disruption of specialty chemical and equipment supply chains would begin to bite within weeks. The economic cost to global technology would compound over subsequent quarters. The most analytically significant strategic implication of the blockade scenario is what it reveals about the gap in the international community's ability to respond to coercion that falls below the threshold of outright invasion. A maritime blockade that operates through insurance market effects rather than physical interdiction, that uses Coast Guard, rather than naval vessels as the primary enforcement instrument, that frames its exclusion zones as military exercises rather than acts of war, sits in the gray zone that the international legal architecture was not designed to address. The asymmetry between China's ability to apply coercive pressure at low immediate military risk and the West's difficulty in responding without accepting significant escalation risk is the structural feature of the gray zone that makes the blockade tool strategically attractive. The first lesson: resilience investment before a crisis. Taiwan's energy vulnerability is not a structural reality that can be changed during a crisis, nor it can only be reduced through years of investment before the scenario occurs. The second, intelligence and early warning. A blockade designed as described would not appear without warning. The analytical challenge is not detection. It is interpretation and policy response to signals that are individually ambiguous and collectively clear only in retrospect. The third, the architecture of deterrence in a world of gray zone competition. Building deterrence that operates across the full spectrum, from gray zone pressure to open war, requires a different portfolio of capabilities and commitments than deterrence designed only for the worst case. The Taiwan blockade scenario is, at its core, a story about how coercive power operates in the space between diplomacy and war, and about the difficulty that the international system has in responding to pressure that is designed precisely to avoid crossing the thresholds that would trigger organized resistance. The uncertainties in this analysis are as important as the certainties. The resilience of Taiwan's population under sustained economic pressure is unknown. The precision with which U.S. and allied decision-making would function is unknown. The accuracy of China's assessment of the threshold at which response becomes military is unknown. What the analysis does establish is the structure of the problem. The blockade scenario is not an aberration or an extreme case. It is the logical extension of a coercive pressure campaign that is already underway, applied through instruments that are already being developed and deployed. Understanding the structure of that campaign, its military logic, its economic mechanisms, its political objectives, and the range of responses it might encounter, is the precondition for developing the deterrence and resilience strategies the scenario demands. Structure does not determine outcomes, but it shapes the options available to every actor in the crisis, establishes the costs of every choice, and creates the conditions within which decisions are made. That is always where the analysis begins. You have been watching The Command Structure. Subscribe if you think in systems.